All right, let's get into it. This isn't just going to be a timeline of a leader's life. No, it's the story of how a man and an entire nation were fundamentally reshaped by crisis and conviction. We're diving into the rise of Vladimir Putin, as detailed in the book, The Cold Strategist. History does not remember caretakers. It remembers men who seize moments. This quote from the book Novellas is really our starting point. It's the core idea here. It frames Putin's entire career not as some historical accident, but as a very deliberate, methodical seizure of opportunity.
And that brings us to the big question we're trying to unpack. Who is Vladimir Putin, really? And what were the forces that shaped his calculated climb from the shadows of the KGB all the way to the absolute center of Russian power?
To answer that, you really have to start at the beginning. Before the Kremlin, before the KGB, there was a world of ruins. And this is where we start to see how the collapse of one world became the blueprint for building another. Take a look at this. This is post-World War II Leningrad, the city where Putin was born. And it was a landscape of survivors, haunted by a siege that killed over 1 million people. The book really emphasizes that growing up here stamped him with this foundational belief. State weakness isn't some abstract idea. No, it leads directly to chaos and unbelievable human suffering. For him, stability wasn't a preference. It was a precondition for survival. So his personal philosophy was really built on these distinct pillars from his youth. From the streets, he learned a simple rule. If a fight is coming, you strike first. From judo, he learned the strategy of using an opponent's own momentum against them. And then from the spy novels he was obsessed with, he got this idea that secrecy and emotional control, well, they aren't just traits, they're weapons. Okay, let's fast forward to 1989. Putin is now a KGB officer stationed in Dresden, East Germany. Now, when the Berlin Wall falls, he doesn't see a celebration of freedom. From his perspective, inside that Soviet system, this was a terrifying spectacle. It was state power just evaporating, order disintegrating into chaos right before his very eyes. And that leads to this absolutely pivotal moment. You have angry crowds surrounding his KGB headquarters, and a young Putin who's been trained his whole life to follow a strict chain of command is frantically calling his superiors in Moscow. He's calling for orders, for backup, for anything. So what do you think he heard on the other end of that line? Nothing. Just silence. Moscow was silent. For an officer of a superpower, that silence was profound. It was the ultimate lesson in state paralysis. The system he dedicated his entire life to, the one he believed was all-powerful, was just abandoning him in real time. And that experience, it forged what the book calls the psychology of collapse. It's this deep-seated conviction that a state's greatest sin is weakness. It's the belief that strength has to be projected relentlessly, because the alternative isn't just decline, it's total disintegration. And this idea becomes the key to understanding everything he does next. So armed with this worldview, Putin returns to a Russia that was itself collapsing, and this is where he would begin his calculated climb right through the middle of all that chaos. The Russia he came home to in the 90s was a nation in total shock. I mean, hyperinflation was wiping out people's savings, a brand new class of oligarchs was grabbing up state assets, and the country standing on the world stage had just vanished. For Putin, this was Dresden all over again, but on a national scale. It just confirmed his worst fears and hardened his resolve. The path he took to power, it wasn't flashy. There were no big populist rallies. It was the systematic, almost bureaucratic climb through the actual mechanics of power. From being a deputy in city government, to managing all of the Kremlin's property, to eventually heading the new KGB, the FSB. Each step just gave him more and more control over the levers of the state. You know, his rise wasn't fueled by public charisma. In the incredibly chaotic court of President Boris Yeltsin, Putin's currency was something way more valuable: competence, discipline, and loyalty. In a system that was basically drowning in intrigue and backstabbing, he made himself the one reliable guy. And being that reliable guy put him in exactly the right place at the right time. Because as the decade came to a close, a moment of intense national fear would give him the perfect springboard to go from being a behind-the-scenes operator to a national leader. So in 1999, a series of just horrific apartment bombings rocked Russia. As the new prime minister, Putin's response was swift, harsh, and totally uncompromising. He launched the Second Chechen War. And that decisive, strongman image, It stood in stark contrast to a decade of what people saw as weakness, and his popularity just skyrocketed. And then came the political masterstroke. On New Year's Eve 1999, an ailing Boris Yeltsin just stunned the world by resigning. And he handed absolute power to his chosen successor, making Vladimir Putin the acting president of Russia. And this just lays it all out so clearly. This was a choice presented to the Russian people in the 2000 election. It was a referendum on the 1990s. Did they want more chaos, more fragmentation, more uncertainty? Or did they want the stability, the unity, and the order that Putin now represented? Well, they overwhelmingly chose order. So once he was securely in power, President Putin didn't just govern. He began a systematic project to rebuild the authority of the state, piece by piece. His first and probably most difficult challenge was the group of powerful oligarchs. These are the guys who in the 90s had captured not just Russia's wealth, but its media empires and its political influence too. To rebuild the state, he first had to crush these independent power centers. So he presented them with a new bargain, a new set of unwritten rules for the new Russia. It was basically, look, you can keep your billions, but you will stay completely out of politics, period. And your media empires, they will support the state's narrative. The message was simple. From now on, all real power flows from one place and one place only, the Kremlin. And the jailing of oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky was the brutal example that proved he was dead serious. Now, this wasn't just about personalities. It was a total structural overhaul. The goal, as the book explains it, was to build a vertical of power. This meant reasserting Moscow's control over every key area, from regional governments to the media to strategic industries like oil and gas. And this brings us right back to the beginning. According to the source, this entire state-building project was the direct, logical result of that one formative lesson he learned as a young KGB officer in a crumbling Dresden. A state that does not command its own future will have one dictated to it by others. All of this, the climb, the consolidation, the reassertion of power, it all leaves us with the book's ultimate, really provocative question about his historical legacy. Was he a restorer who saved a failing state from collapse? A ruler who simply perfected the art of authoritarian control? Or a revisionist intent on rewriting the rules of the post-Cold War world? The book leaves that for history to decide, but it makes one thing crystal clear. His rise was no accident. It was the methodical work of an architect of order.